Mr. Rollins,
Hey,
what a pleasure to see you.
it's been a while, hasn't it?
It really has been. Well,
And for
actually,
especially
I've,
you. I mean,
I've
we've
seen you more
we've
than
seen each
they've
other.
seen you because
Exactly.
Jim
This is
has actually come down to sign all of his books for the last couple of years because it's so many that he doesn't want to have them show up in his front doorstep. But then we haven't done it live in the bookstores. So this is really exciting. And it's kicking off our entire 2022 season. So yay!
Yay! Is it okay to take this off?
Yes, and I was just thinking, I'm not sure I know how to talk without a microphone. I'm
I
gonna
am.
have to
I'm
wave the
triple
water
vaccinated,
bottle or
and I
something.
tested myself on the morning out here, so I should be. I was negative, so hopefully I won't be passing anything to you.
All right, well, I'm negative too. And as some of you may know, we had a positive person in the store last week, so we closed Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to make sure that everybody was okay, and happily everybody is. But we wanted to make sure that we wouldn't give Jim or you or our staff or anybody. Anyway, we're here to talk about a very exciting new venture. And so Jim has a kind of long origin story to tell you.
Yeah, I mean, how many people don't know I've never written fantasy before in my life? So you've all sort of known I've written fantasy. So that's been a surprise to a lot of people, trust me. Got emailed just recently. Why did you switch to science fiction and fantasy? Well, I haven't switched. Just returning to those roots.
Wouldn't it be fair to say that in Sigma Force there are certain fantastical elements?
Of course.
From time to
I
time?
always thought Sigma Force had a strong sci-fi
Absolutely
element
right.
to them. I mean, I'm always taking you to fantastical places and seeing what I can get you all to believe. And you know, my goal now is to do the same in a fantasy landscape. But for those that don't know, have I talked to you before? I know I've seen a lot of familiar faces, Andrew and a few other faces here all the time. How I ended up writing two different genres, thrillers and fantasy. Did I ever tell you that story? No? Well, I told you the beginning part of the story. I told you how when I was writing my first, what I thought was science fiction. You know, I thought my first novel, Subterranean, which takes place 2 miles underneath Antarctica. It has telepathic marsupial creatures that live underneath Antarctica. So I thought it was science fiction. My editor said, no, you said it in present time, therefore it is a thriller. As long as you're buying it. Call it whatever you want. At that point, I wasn't picky because Subterranean took a long time from origin to publication. It was rejected. I mentioned this before, I'm sure, because I mentioned this a lot. It was rejected by 49 different agents and editors during the course of submitting it. Some of them weren't kind. One rejection was, you know, just a form letter that says, you know, dear sir, ma'am, you know, we don't want your novel. Stop writing, editor. So after 49 of those, I began to be convinced that maybe I'm not a thriller writer or a science fiction writer. So when I was sort of learning the craft of how to write, one of the things I read was, you know, you should always be working on something new. And something, whenever I teach writing, I always emphasize that. If you want to be a successful writer, you need to be productive. You should have something else in your back pocket. So I began working, jump genre. Thought, well, maybe I'm not getting all those rejections from the professional New York publishing establishment that, you know, this is unpublishable. So I thought, well, I'm going to jump and try with my hand at fantasy writing. And so I began working on this novel, and I was about maybe 3/4 of the way through the novel when I get that 50th agent that says, hey, I like what I just read. I think I can find a home for it. In the back of my head, I'm thinking, you're crazy. First, it was also 6 o'clock in the morning because apparently everybody in New York does not realize the West Coast is 3 hours different. So I was a little bit tired. I just pulled a long shift at the veterinary hospital. So it was like, I wasn't quite believing she was actually even not a figment of my imagination. And so I'm just babbling for a while and, you know, thrilled, you know, one question all agents eventually are going to ask you is, you know, what are you working on next? So, you know, I think I can sell Subterranean, but I want to be able to sell something with it. I said, go for it. And I said, well, I'm working on this new fantasy novel. I'm really excited about it. I'm almost done it. I actually am so excited about it. I submitted the first part of that novel to a contest that I'm really excited about. And she goes, oh, no. I don't know anybody in the fantasy world. I don't know any fantasy editors. Stop writing that. Write me another thriller. And this is the same original phone call. This isn't like a second phone call or follow-up. This is the same phone call, and I don't want to lose her. So I said, yes, ma'am. I will stop writing this fantasy, and we'll get to work right now on another thriller. I already have some ideas. Just give me a couple weeks to work on this. Hung up the phone. That was a lie. Fiction writers, we're allowed to lie. So I had a point that I'm sitting there and thought, well, gosh, you really want something new, but I'm 3/4 of the way this novel. I just can't, I don't want to quit it. It's hard when you're that far along to stop writing something. The end is in sight. The trains are on the track. I got to finish this thing. Plus, I already submitted to a contest. It was the Maui Writers Conference. Going to be my very first writing conference. I've never been to a writing conference before. I was very excited about it. They had it's a big conference, and if you're ever gonna, ever want to go to a writing conference, go to the Maui Writers Conference. We're gonna pick the first one. So it was a combination vacation. Didn't think there was really much hope for me to become a successful writer, but I thought at least they'll have fun in Maui, and I can go surf afterwards. Not that I can surf. Don't want to imply that I can surf, but let's just pretend I can. So I thought, well, that was the beginning of that phone call came at the beginning of summer, and the conference was at the end of summer. I thought, well, I'm going to use the next 2 or 3 months of the rest of summer to finish my fantasy novel. I will see if she has any success in finding a home for Subterranean. And at the back of my mind, I'm thinking, it's never going to happen. She's never going to be successful. So I'm just going to finish this fantasy novel. So I worked on that through the rest of the summer, and she began collecting rejection notes from the publishing world, which further supported my thesis that I was not a good thriller writer. I told you so. Didn't actually tell her that. And so first day of the conference, there's sort of a meet and greet tea where the participants can interact with the panelists and the invitees. It was a big conference. There was like 600 people in attendance. And the first day of the conference, they had sort of like it was in a big ballroom, end of summer, Maui. Keep that in mind. So keep that in my head. End of summer, Maui. They require men to wear jackets because it's a literary event. If you have little patches on your thing, it's even better. More likely to be published if you have the little patches right there. So I walk into this ballroom. Again, never been to a conference, have no writing credentials, nothing. I've got my back pocket. If anybody talks to me, I got an agent. I'm going to just lower that over everybody. So you could wear a Hawaiian t-shirt, or a Hawaiian shirt, but you have to wear the jacket. So it's hot. I'm nervous. I don't know how properly to break into a conversation, especially everybody seemed to as soon as they walked in, they all clustered into little groups and were talking amongst themselves. And that's one of the circles of hell for me is that type of environment. So I'm nervous, not sure what proper protocol is, what etiquette is, and I'm wandering around, and you wander up to a group and go, I like dogs and hope for the best. I wasn't quite sure, so I was getting more and more nervous, and I look across the ballroom, and in the distance I see somebody that I recognize. It's a friend of mine from Sacramento. Not a dear friend, it's like a friend of a friend. But trust me, that's a close enough bond that we're going to be, melded at the hip for the rest of this conference. So I rush up to him, I grab him on the shoulder and go, what are you doing here? I can't believe you're here. And he turns around and it's not my friend, it's Ron. It's Ron Howard. Yeah, the director, Opie. Because if you ever see Ron Howard, just doesn't have a lot of hair up here, but usually has a baseball cap. So, but when it's his cap, he looks exactly like my friend from Sacramento. He was not. So he turns to me and goes, well, sir, I was invited. And I go, okay. I was just checking, making sure no one's crashing the event. Try to slip myself out of that conversation, tail between my legs, and now I'm even more nervous, and I got to worry about Ron Howard's security, and wander around this conference, and I look across the room and I see somebody I recognize. I wised up this time. I circled him first a few times, make sure it wasn't Ron Howard in disguise, and check the name tag. This, by the way, that's awful useful information there. And it was Terry Brooks, who is the author of the Shannara series. He pronounced it something different. He's wrong. It's Shannara. Everybody say it out loud. Shannara.
Shannara.
How he pronounces it, it's weird. And so, Mr. Brooks, I'm a big fan of yours. Just to meet you in person, it's so excited. And I've read you growing up, and did the typical, fanboy gender flexion before him. And he looks at my name tag, and I said a couple seconds, yeah, I'm a big fan of yours too. And I thought, oh, wow, I thought it was rude. I thought he was like making fun of me. And he goes, no, I was one of the judges at this year's conference, and I read your fantasy piece, and my editor came here personally all the way to Maui to meet you. And then based upon that personal introduction, I ended up with an offer for a 3-book fantasy contract with Del Rey Books. Nice. So I promptly, called my agent and said, hey, I think I sold my fantasy novel. Would you want to do the contracts and help me through it? Sure, I love fantasy. Nothing like that, 15%, I tell you. And she goes, oh, by the way, right now I have 2 publishers bidding on Subterranean. So I went from 1 week unpublished, just a veterinarian working in his office and telling stories during my lunch hour, to suddenly I had 2 different publishing houses, 2 different genres. And eventually, it met Terry Brooks. And
Ron Howard.
And Ron Howard, yeah.
That, right.
I have a horrible problem with apparently assaulting directors. So I'll tell you what, it has nothing to do with the fantasy novel, probably nothing, maybe it's of interest to me and maybe not to you, is that I went to Comic-Con, I was promoting, I can't remember which book it was, I don't know if it was the fantasy series or it was the thriller series. I get them all blurred together, but it was back several years ago. And I ended up getting like a lot of garbage, if you go to Comic-Con, they just hand you a lot of stuff, and eventually you want to get rid of it. It's nice, but I don't really want this. And so I have this pile of stuff in my hand, and I'm looking for a trash can to get rid of it. And there's like a kiosk that's selling like hot dogs and cookies, and there's a long line of people waiting to get their food there. And there's a trash can, of course, right next to the kiosk. Well, there's a perfect place for me to dump this. So I'm working through this packed crowd of Comic-Con people, and this little break in the line so I can get to the trash can behind it. So I quickly just sort of shoved my hand there, and right as this person was stepping forward, and I hit him right in the stomach. It's Quentin Tarantino. Yeah. So apparently I have a problem with assaulting directors out there. So I will try to do better. So that was how I ended up with 2 different careers. And for the first decade, pretty much I was writing a thriller and a fantasy every year. Eventually, Rollins sort of overtook Clemens, my fantasy pseudonym.
Okay, just a moment.
Yeah.
Would you spell out what you wrote fantasy as?
It was under James Clemens. So again, it's a poorly kept secret that Rollins is not my last name too. Does everybody know that? Can I admit that? It's in the copyright everywhere. And if you look at the copyright, you'll know why I have a pen name. It's Polish with like every letter of the alphabet in
I'm
some
going to
weird order.
intervene and tell you that at one point Jim came to do an event for us, and we were in our different time zones, so Jim thought we were still on California time, but of course we were back on Mountain Standard
I
Time.
remember that.
And so he didn't show up. And I thought, where is he? And then I thought, maybe he's at the Hotel Valley Ho, where all the authors stay, because we have a poison pen rate. So I rushed over to the Hotel Valley Ho, and I asked for James Rollins, and they said, no, there's nobody here by that name. And I thought for a minute, oh my God, I know he has another name, but I can't spell it. I can't pronounce it. So I called back to the bookstore and said, can you tell me, look it up on the back. What is his actual name? Which is what he was registered under at the Valley Ho. So they're all cracking up at the desk, while I'm going, hello, Jim. So eventually we were here.
Hence why I need a pen name. And
That's
because
right.
I had 2 different.
But you should travel under it. That's the point.
It gets confusing because sometimes some publicists will book me under the Rollins name.
Right.
And I don't know that, so I give my real name, and I said, no, there's nobody under that. Well, is it Rollins? Oh yeah, we have Rollins. Can I have your ID? Well, this doesn't match it. Then I gotta go find one of my books and
look it up.
it's the same person. I really am the same person.
Now, I'm going to add that if any of you read Steve Berry, who's a friend of Jim's and who has wonderful books, the last book is set in Warsaw. And did you notice that the name of the president of Poland is, in fact?
That's how I really spell my name.
Right. So if you
Yeah.
can, but anyway, I derailed you. But it's clear that the Maui Writers Conference attracts directors, right? Along with other.
Yeah, they had a whole screenwriting track, so they brought a lot of
Right.
Hollywood people there for that event too. So
Right. So what inspired you after letting Rollins overtake Clemens to write this book?
well,
The
part of it,
Starless Crown. Let me hold it up again. There it is.
there's several reasons. One of it was COVID, is that I suddenly had a little break in time in which I could potentially work on another project, because a lot of my books got delayed because they were trying to find a way of avoiding. Like this book was supposed to come out at the end of summer, but because of COVID, they said let's wait until January.
And it'll be-
Perfect timing, by the way. I think they should stop publishing me, because it seems like anytime I publish a novel, there's a plague. Because The Last Odyssey came out mid-March of 2020, and you know how that all worked out. So I forgot what we were talking about. What's the question?
My question was, why did you come back to writing fantasy after Rollins had overtaken
I had a little
Clemens?
break, but I also, if you're a writer, you always have your antenna up for that next idea. You're always looking for some concept that might be really cool. And so I had this idea of setting a story. Well, initially I thought it was going to be our plan. I thought, what if the Earth stopped spinning? What might happen? So I did a lot of research, how could it would have to stop spinning very slowly, otherwise the winds would pretty much strip the planet of almost everything on its surface. And I thought, well, why would that happen? So I was going to do a thriller based upon somebody that was working with some type of weird technology that was going to stop the planet from spinning. But I thought, well, what's more interesting. Let's go several millennia into the future, and what might that planet look like if the planet stopped spinning? So one side was forever facing the sun and being blasted and burned. The other side was perpetually in darkness and frozen, and the only habitable area would be sort of the transition area, the twilight lands between those two extremes, this sort of circlet of areas where you could potentially live. And so I talked to some astrobiologists and astrophysicists to find out, can you have life on such a planet? And they said, yeah, it's under certain circumstances and why this would happen. And so I began building this story, and it basically was in Post-it notes and scrawled in journals and articles I ripped out and people I talked to, and it began sort of accumulating. Literally, I didn't know whether it was going to be a thriller set in present time or whether it was going to be a fantasy set way, way in the future. Well, you know what ended up winning. And the other reason why I started working on that is that a good friend of mine, he's a fantasy book critic, and he's a big fan of my Godslayer series, one of the books I was writing prior to abandoning Mr. Clemens. And he had said, hey, I like the maps that are in Godslayer. Would you mind if I hired a cartographer / graphic artist to do a fanciful version of that land, do a better map, basically? I said, sure, go for it. And so we did, and he showed me the result. It was so beautiful. And then I had sort of sketches of what I thought this landscape that I wanted to build was going to look like. And I thought, I want her to do this. What she did to that land, I want to do this. And so she did, and was so excited about that I had to begin writing it. Is that, most writers, and I've told this before, when I get an idea stuck in my head, it's hard for me to let it go. That's the reason why I got an idea for, vampires in the Vatican that I couldn't let go. And so eventually I called Rebecca Cantrell and said, hey, I got the story. It's going to be gothic and rich in history and sort of, taking a weird look at the past. And she goes, what's it about? And I said, vampires. She said, no, don't want to write a vampire book. So no, it's not just a vampire book. So I laid out everything that I'd done the research on and the mythology, and eventually goes, oh, that is cool. So then I had to write it. So unless it's out of my head, it sort of festers back there, and I have to let it go. So I was working on this story. Probably I had the inkling of that story, and I actually have my original email from that I sent to my agent, talking about whether I wanted to do a thriller or wanted to do a fantasy. And that was about 7.5 years ago, where I pitched him. I've already been working on the idea, but then I didn't know which way to go. And he said, go fantasy. So he also said, this feels like the more exciting story to tell this way.
So you said he, but originally you were saying agent she. So
Right.
somewhere along the line, there's been a change
Yeah,
of agent.
my first agent retired.
Okay.
So then I have a new agent after that, which was easy. Once you're published, it was very easy to find an agent. It's like, hey, I got some books. Want 50%? Sure. Okay.
Right. So if you look in your book, there is a map. There is a really lovely map, and it looks to me slightly like the British Isle, with things on, either side of it. I mean, so
It
it won't
could
be.
very well be.
It could well be. It won't. It won't look enormously foreign to you, but it's really helpful. I love having maps in books. There are two schools of thought about, whether maps are, and I think in historical fiction or any place where the geography is either conceived and not real, or it's in an historical one, it's going to be different. The political divisions and everything are going to be different than the modern ones. I think it's really helpful.
Yeah,
to
the
have
same
them.
artist did a colorized version of that map that anybody follows him on social media. I posted on social media. It's very cool. So you'll see
Right.
more of that.
So when you wrote the book, did
Yes.
you have the map first?
Yes.
So you were able to keep it on.
A little bit of both. I mean, there was a rough version of the map, and I did a webcam where I actually revealed what my original map looked like, which looks like a first grader drew it, and that's being generous to me. Most first grader probably could do a better job than I did with that, and then it transformed into what she did. It's like, look, this is the way it's supposed to look. But again, it was sketchy. Several things changed during the course of writing the novel, so I had to change place names to switch some of the geography around a little bit. But there's a lot of Easter eggs built into that map that I had to see that are going to be playing out as the series commences.
So in order to write a fantasy, you have to do what's called world building, which you are fantasy fans, I'm sure you're all familiar with. Or there's George R. Martin building. By the way, did you see he's going to have a prequel to Game of Thrones?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, he's never going to finish the last Game of Thrones novel, right? But he can, meantime, sorry, George. Meantime, he can go back and write a prequel. But I mean, he had to conceive of that whole world, which, if you ever happen to go to Ireland, almost all of it was filmed in Northern Ireland. I have been there and seen much of the territory and so forth. So it probably, if I really looked at it, some of that of Westerworld probably looks like Northern Ireland, or maybe Northern Ireland looked like Westerworld. I'm not really sure. But you have to, there's so many things to consider. What's the whole process you went through in the world building?
Well, world building is always, it's fun for me because I mean, leans into my research side of my personality, which those that have read my Sigma novels, I like to do research, and I probably make you read too much of it. Sorry, but I like it. And so when it came to world building, it's almost the same way. So there's a lot of research involved on the mythology and the history and how everything works in this world, and whatever. Even just finding the vocabulary was challenging, and I forgot. It had been a decade since I'd written a fantasy, and people back when I was writing both, and it was a poorly kept secret that I was writing both, would ask me, which do you prefer to write, fantasy or thrillers? And I always say, whatever I wasn't working on then, I liked the other. Because it seemed like whatever problems I was having during writing this novel, like I'm writing a thriller, I'm thinking, gosh, I painted my characters in a corner. I need a magic wand to get them out of this corner, so I have no idea how to get them out of this corner. And when I'm writing the fantasy, I'm thinking, I need a telephone, or I need a car, because I put my characters in a spot in the world where I need to get them somewhere very far, very fast. I'm not trying to do it. So, and world building is challenging because I like trying to keep the pace going at the same time as not leaving you lost. And it's a balancing act between giving you all the information you need to know to understand the world that I've crafted and the characters that I'm building, but keep keep that roller coaster still running. Keep you engaged in the story. And so it's a juggling act. I forgot how difficult it is to carry that out.
So there has to be a physical world, and then you have to come up with all the systems that make a world work. You have to do economics, you have to do government, you have to think about money, you have to think about all sorts of things. Now, since you're writing in English, that's going to be the language, but then names become, what are you going to call the place names, and what are you going to call the people?
So I have like a long, ongoing vocabulary, so I'm consistent with, what different, and again, even different lands would have different words for the same thing. So it's a lot to keep track of.
Well, it is. I mean, you're basically creating a foreign language, and you need a compendium to, to keep it going. I mean, obviously for Sigma Force, you've learned the names of the characters now, but naming things is hard. So, was it harder when you are not using traditional names, but you're making up names?
Uh, I wouldn't say it's any harder or easier, to be honest with you, because you usually I try to craft a name that it somewhat fits that character.
Yeah.
Gray Pierce, is called Gray because he's sort of a juxtapositions of extremes. He's has a spiritual side but a scientific side. He's got a violent side, but also he has a very peaceful side that he's tries to achieve. So there's it's a dichotomy. So I pick Gray because he's sort of between those two extremes. With fantasy, you're not stuck with it. It has to be sort of a name people know, or at least will recognize that as not a totally made up name.
Yeah.
So with fantasy, you have the ability to even play a little bit more with that.
So what are a couple of the key names in the book?
Well, the main character is a young orphan girl. Her name is Nyx, and she was born near blind. So she can see shadows, light and darkness, but most of the world is obscured behind a veil. And she grew up that way, and she's known none other way of living, so she's adjusted to that ability. She gets attacked by one of the sort of apex predators of this world, which there's schematics and drawings of a lot of the animals you're going to see in the book that were crafted by a wonderful artist named Dania Fiddler, who did a beautiful job with the art. And she's poisoned by this. In the fever dream of that poisoning, she has a vision of the moon, my little moon here, crashing into the planet and destroying all life. A cheery little dream. And then the poison that she's poisoned with clears that veil from her eyes, and she wakes up from her fever dream with the ability to see, which in and of itself is disturbing for her because that's just known in another world. And so many people think, oh, you're blessed because your sight has returned. But her, she doesn't think of it necessarily as a blessing. To her, the world is now a strange and an unusual place. So it was fun sort of developing that side of her personality, along with the fact that, was her dream prophetic? And rumblings begin to, as the word spreads of her prophecy. Other people have also had indications. Some scientists in this world, alchemists in this world, have also noticed that the moon has been gradually growing larger, the face of the moon. And so they're concerned that possibly it's tumbling towards the earth also. But prophecies of doom during a time of war are not welcome. And there's a major war brewing amongst the lands of the crown. And so her prophecies are dismissed initially and then considered to be possibly the work of, which we're trying to, not bad press, but just trying to blank on what I'm trying to say. So she bands together with a bunch of different. There's like a broken knight that is in the novel who has a pair of wolf-like creatures called Vargr that accompany him. There's a recalcitrant thief who was imprisoned in a mine. There's a autonomous figure, that statue that seems to move. So many mysteries to solve in the course of this novel to try to find a way, is a prophecy true? And if it is, how to stop it. So that is the big quest, the main thrust of that novel.
And if this is the start of a series, then obviously there's more to come, right?
Yeah, and we have a venture into the cold side of the world, into the burn side of the world. So there's all different lands and peoples you're going to be experiencing during the course of that novel.
So I'm going to go back and say that when you read the opener, the prologue, you have to realize that Jim is a scientist because the birth scene is remarkably accurate and pretty ghastly. And you really, her mother, who is a really tough, you can tell that the bloodline is that she's passing on to her daughter is going to be extremely tough, in that she survives long enough to give birth to this little girl. And I have to say, have you actually hung out in obstetrical wards?
I did when I was a pre-vet. I worked at a hospital for 2 years prior to becoming a vet. So I sort of went through different levels of the hospital. So there was a period of time I was in the obstetric ward.
It's a very realistic scene. Yuck. Anyway, I was like, whatever. But you could just tell from the trauma of her birth, that hers is going to be an interesting life. Now we were watching Wheel of Time. Dana Stabenow was a big science fiction fan, is spending some time with us, and I wonder to myself, why is it that so much epic fantasy is basically medieval? I mean, we'd if we watched The Hobbit, for example. There are a lot of parallels. Let me tell you what, between Tolkien um, and Robert Jordan, for sure. But I thought to myself, I wonder if you're writing fantasy, does it need to be really futuristic with all kinds of cool gadgets and rockets and fabulous machinery and all the rest, or does it have to be medieval? Is there a middle
I
ground?
mean, fantasy again.
I
That's
don't
probably
read a
one
lot
of
of
the.
it, so I'm
Well,
asking
I
out of
still
ignorance.
do, and so there's a sort of resurgence of some very interesting ways that people are doing fantasy now. Uh, they're looking at different cultures. There's the Broken Earth series, which I'm just trying to blank on the name of the author. Won the Hugo Award. Thank you, Jemison. She won the Hugo Award for all 3 volumes of her fantasy. And so there's some intriguing stuff that's being done with fantasy. And my goal with this was to, now tip of my hat towards the expected tropes of fantasy, but also to bring it somewhere different.
Mhm.
I describe it sort of a scientific fantasy because there is a lot of sort of strange science that occurs in this novel too, strange biology. I not only did I look at astrophysicists, I looked up with the xenobiologists and evolutionary biologists to find out how would life grow in this tidally locked planet. How might life evolve in such a planet to try to make it as realistic as I can.
Of
So
course, you have some previous experience. Any of
exactly.
you know what it will mean if I say Yellowstone? Yes, but do you remember the creatures in the, what are they, extremophobes? Is that what they were called?
Extremophobes, yep.
So
Extremophiles.
extremophobes. So you've already looked into that.
Oh yeah. I mean,
Um,
that's I mean, my undergraduate degree was in evolutionary biology. So that's
ah,
why I have a tendency to lean towards a lot of strange animals and creatures, and why I still have Amazonia because it's the first time I got to sort of do weird creatures in a jungle. So
it was his Michael Crichton coming out, right? We needed a replacement. But a nice thing in your copy of the book is that there are drawings of these interesting creatures that Jim is thinking up. Apex predators, what does that actually mean?
it's like the top of the food chain. Is that there's a giant carnivorous bats that live in the swamp that are basically rule the land of that landscape, and they're the tigers and lions of that world. So there's nothing that will defeat these bats, and but they're not exactly what you think they are. But which I'm not going to tell you. You'll discover a lot of it when you read the story. But
That brings me to an interesting question. We do so many mystery events, thriller events, where we're not allowed to have spoilers. We're all here panicking, don't want. And I wonder, does the same thing apply to talking about a fantasy? Are we able to
yes,
talk about the ending? No,
no,
apparently not. Okay, you've answered my question.
no,
Um,
many mysteries to be solved in the course of the
okay, so
fantasy
it's the same
fantasy novel.
dynamic. One day I'm going to do a biography event or something, right? We're all how it comes out. Because sometimes the most interesting questions are the ones most of the time, the most interesting questions are the ones we can't ask, right? Yeah. But anything, I noticed then, I was going to read this, but you've already mentioned it. To build this world, you consulted with evolutionary biologists, astrophysicists, and even leaned on your own background as a veterinarian. How do you approach people to get them interested in helping you? And why should they help you, in point of fact?
Most scientists, especially, love to talk about their work. They want an audience. So if there are any writers out there, don't be afraid to pick up a phone and you call a university and ask, can I speak to so and so? And I'm especially if you're open, I'm a novelist working on the story. Would you be willing to help me? Because I think secretly these scientists, their spouses don't want to hear about their science. So when they have a willing audience, they're very happy to talk to you. Uh, when I wrote Amazonia, one of your favorite novels, and one of the little factoids I had gotten was just out of a magazine was a detail that how the reason why Arctic wood frogs can be frozen solid and then thaw was because of a certain chemical in the blood, and why there's a scientist that was working on doing AIDS research on mice. So that she developed a strain of mice that didn't have an immune system. And she discovered when the immune system was gone, that for some bizarre reason, mice developed the ability to regrow bodily limbs. If you cut off their tails would grow back. If you broke their backs, eventually they would begin to walk again. Fascinating stuff. So I put that in the book. And I referenced again, I mentioned the researcher by name. And 4 or 5 years later, I'm coming back from lunch from the veterinary hospital, and there's a call from the veterinary hospital saying, hey, there's a woman on the line, or there's a guy on the line, and he wants to speak to you about one of your books. Well, that's weird. Why is he calling my veterinary office? And so I pick up the phone, and it's the husband of that researcher. He had just picked up Amazonian, was reading through it, and discovered his wife's research, mentioned in the story. And so he probably shouldn't keep my real name as a copyright. So he found, and it was probably kept secret, that I was a veterinarian in Sacramento, and not too many veterinarians in Sacramento with my last name. So it wasn't a detailed search to find out where I was. He just wanted to thank me for, incorporating his wife's research in this novel. So they're very appreciative to help if they can.
Well, I know, we've heard writers over the years talk about policemen or whatever it is, who are willing to share tips or procedure and so forth with crime writers. So I assumed it would sort of be the same.
Yeah, I think scientists maybe more so. At least, policemen and firemen probably have more social lives, and their actions are somewhat more appreciated, maybe, because there's like television shows everywhere about policemen and firemen. There's Chicago PD and but scientists are sitting in little labs working on their test tubes, and no one wants to hear them banter on about the details of their work, but I want to hear the details of their work.
Do y'all remember what a rock star Carl Sagan was? I mean, he was a very visible, very personable scientist, and I thought did a wonderful job in bringing a lot of things to people's attention. But he was not the norm, is what you're saying.
No.
No.
Carl Sagan was more of he's a popular scientist, and he was, and again, if you, what's his name? Neil. I know there's a middle name. I couldn't remember what the middle name was. He's again a popular scientist. So certain scientists, have the ability to articulate difficult scientific thoughts into terms that are more digestible. And Carl Sagan was great at that, and so was Neil. I've heard Neil speak a couple times. Just a very dynamic speaker too.
So
but most scientists are not that way.
They're
Usually
not.
They're introverted. They're quiet. They don't like to brag too much, but they're very interested in their material.
We're going to do an event at the end of January, and it's about a woman named Rosalind Franklin. Do any of you know who she was? Well, she was the person that when the double helix was written, James Watkins and what's his name? Frick. Right. Anyway, it was her research that was actually the basis of their book and so forth, but they didn't give her any credit for it. It's a very controversial thing now. And unfortunately, like Marie Curie, she didn't really understand or pay attention to the negative effects of radiation on the human body. So she died young. Marie Curie actually lived a surprisingly long time for a person who was bombarded, with radiation all the time. But the Rosalind Franklin story is a really interesting one, and it illustrates that scientists are not all utopian. They're not all generous. There's a lot. It'll be a really interesting discussion. I think I liked the book very much, but I think it's a community obviously where rewards are sometimes not monetary, or they may be in terms of status and other stuff. So I do think it's wonderful that you find generous ones, but you're not impinging, I'll get the word. You're not impinging on their actual work. I mean, they're willing to share it, but you're not
stealing their work too much.
Exactly. You're not a competitor, an apex predator in the science. Right, so I have one more question, then let's throw it open to the audience. We see Nix at her birth, and then we meet her as she is a student. And that seems to me to be kind of a trope in an awful lot of fantasy. There's always a young and relatively innocent, untried person, but a person with special gifts somehow. or Frodo, just that kind of a character, whatever it might be. Because he's a hobbit, he's not subject to greed and other stuff, and he's the one guy that might actually get the ring to to where it needs to go, to Mordor. So is a main character a point of view character? Is it helpful to have somebody young and informing as you writing the story, because she is forming as she's going through school?
I think it's always good to have somebody that starts innocent but has if you look at Luke Skywalker, initially he has this desire, but you don't know his secret history, and he's called to action. First he refuses the action, and then eventually he's forced to come to the forefront. It's basically Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, pretty typical. But also, it's those that have read my books, I don't like to deal with just one character. I have a tendency to everything being an ensemble cast.
Right.
Nix is obviously the main character of the story, but there's many different prominent roles in the story and the way things unfold. So I like to see this world through different eyes, not through the innocence of Nix, but also through the grizzled bitterness of the Broken Knight, to the thief that was imprisoned because he was betrayed by his guild. So you see different areas of the world, you see different viewpoints of what it means to them. So, but you need that central character that's going to carry you through the adventure. And I've always resisted the trope of the chosen one. I've always tried to avoid the chosen one mythology as much as I can. Even Nix, she's basically an ordinary girl. She has no special abilities as the story unfolds, and it's more just chance that falls upon her that she gets poisoned by this giant bat that thrusts her into a new role. When I did my first fantasy series, the Witchfire series, the main character is Elena, who also was a young woman who comes to power. And in that world, magic had always been wielded by men, and women were never allowed, or were never seemed to have the ability to wield magic. And then centuries prior to the beginning of the story, magic vanished in the world. And the way this magic worked was that these mages in the past would thrust their hand up, and their hand would vanish, and when they pulled it back, it would appear blood red. And they'd have blood magic they can expel until their hand turned pale again. Then they have to beseech the gods to get a second helping of that magic. So at one point, centuries prior to the beginning of the story, everyone put up their hand, these mages pulled their hand back, and nothing came back. Their hands were gone. Centuries later, there's a girl in an apple field picking apples with her brother. She reaches up to grab an apple, hand vanishes, pulls her hand out, hand comes back blood red. So that's where that story is. So I like the idea of somebody that's I didn't want her to have any special mythology or any special ability. It's just that this happens, that this falls upon her, and how she has to deal with that. And now she's dealing with the return of magic, but she's the only a girl, a female that's wielding magic that's never been wielded before. So I like turning those tropes around a little bit, because back when I wrote Witchfire, which was 20 years ago, it seemed like it was always the farm boy that was finding the magic amulet, or it was always seemed to be more the guys that would seem to have this ability. So I wanted to sort of flip that whole thing on its ear a little bit and make her to be the one dealing with that. So
starting off on a quest.
So I like honoring the tropes, but at the same time trying to take you somewhere different. I want you have certain expectation. Well, I think this is where it's going because this is what I've seen from fantasy in the past. But then I'm just going to turn it 180 degrees and just give you a little bit of whiplash as the story goes in a totally different direction that you weren't anticipating.
Questions? Any of you would like to ask a question or make a comment?
Yes.
So, any potential movie deals for this series are going to be on hold because you assault director?
Maybe that's why I'm having such a hard time getting Sigma Force or any of these books onto screen, as I keep assaulting these people.
Probably Ron Howard would be a better choice than Quentin Tarantino, right? Yes, ma'am.
What do you get bored by or find more tedious in the course of your writing?
What do I find more tedious between the two genres, or just in general? I don't know if it's so much tedious as that as I've run into this every time I get to the middle of a book, I have this sudden panic that I've lost all talent. That I get to the point where I think this story is crap. I'm going to have to return my advance. I'm going to have to pick up my scalpel and go back to the veterinary office because I've lost whatever talent I've had. But because I don't want to pay back the advance. I put my nose down and I just keep working on that story. And then once I get to the end, I go, actually, that's not bad. I sort of like that story. I keep thinking, surely that won't happen with the next book. Well, I'm working on my 40th book. And I'm right there right now. So right now, nobody say he doesn't have any talent, because right now I'm at that point with the story where it's like, oh no.
Middle is the hardest part, right?
The
for
middle,
sure.
the middle doldrums is what I call it. Is that the middle part of the novel? Because when you first start a novel, it's exciting, it's new, and you're exploring the characters and the plot, and you're getting the engine running. And the other, like I said, I was 3/4 of the way through that fantasy, and it's hard to let the story go by that point because you see the end in sight. You know, you got all these balls in the air. You want to make sure they drop in the right places, and it's exciting. But the spot in between that is that panic area where you're just afraid that you're not going to get to this point, or it's going to come out crappy, and so there's all this insecurity that builds up. Yes.
I don't remember which author it was, but he said he always stops writing that day just when it's getting good to make sure that he goes back the next day. Do you have goals for how many words you do each day or each week or anything like that?
I do, by the way, lean towards that. I have a tendency not to try to stop my writing like at the end of a chapter. Even if I've sort of completed what I consider my writing day and I've ended a chapter, I will at least try to start the next part of the chapter, because it is too easy to slip into that groove and go, well, this is a good stopping point for me to take a break, and I don't want that to happen. Back when I was employed as a veterinarian, I had my own clinic, so I was juggling different hats, and I was just writing during breaks in time, right during my lunch hour, whatever. I didn't get writing during the day, I would write at night. It took me a while to find out how that fit with my professional life, is where I could fit this hobby of writing. And so to me, I thought, well, maybe I'll do it like a certain amount of time that I'll set, that I have to write an hour every day. Well, then I find out I can outfox myself. I'll do some research. Oh, look, the time's gone by and I've written not a single word. So I realized I actually can't do that. I got to put a word count. So I thought, well, I'm going to try to do, I'm going to do 3 pages a day. Every day I'm going to 3 pages. I thought, no, that's too hard. I'm going to do 3 double-spaced pages a day. Basically a page and a half. Not every day. I'm going to do it 5 out of 7 days of the week. But once I reached that point, I thought, well, this is actually pretty comfortable. I can do 3 double-spaced pages 5 out of 7 days of the week and not feel like I'm not living any life but veterinary medicine and this weird guy working on stories in his back room. I always thought if I ever go to the day job, I'd be much more productive. And I am, of course, because now I don't have my day job at all. I do 5 double-spaced pages a day. I found that's my limit. I have a tendency it takes me an hour for me to write 1 page. And so for me, 5 pages is about 5 hours of new writing. And the other part of my day is usually doing that research, calling that scientist up, getting on the internet and checking things, or the business side of writing, social media. So that takes up the other chunk of the day. And that's, to me, I do that 5 out of 7 days of the week. So that's...
One more back there. Yep.
Yes.
An outline that you set up for yourself, and then you have like an end in mind when you're writing?
That's a debate that many authors have had, and when we've got deep in our cups, we've had conversations about whether you should outline or not. I've been on panels where this group they outline their stories, and this group just writes from the seat of their pants, and usually by the end of the panel they're in a fist fight because their minds just don't know how to operate the same way. They're just wired totally different. I'm somewhere in between those two. Is that, to me, especially as my stories are very plot driven, I need a little bit of a skeletal outline. I will know, like I know where the 4th book in this fantasy will end. I know exactly where the story is going to end. I know what's going to happen. I know obviously where it starts, but I only know like 3 or 4 tent poles within a novel that I know that's going to carry the story forward. But I don't know how A connects to B connects to C when I start writing. To me, one of the joys of writing is that discovery along the way, is trying to figure out what's going to happen. Is that if I know the story too well, It's like watching a rerun. It's not as exciting as the first time. I like that that dynamism of not necessarily knowing exactly how this is all going to work out or how the twists and turns that characters are going to take. So I work with a very loose outline, but I definitely know where I need to end. I think it's important that you have sort of a train station you're gonna pull in at the end, so that when you're laying down these tracks, you at least roughly know where you need to end up. Otherwise, it could be a little bit easy to get lost in the woods.
And a lot of rewriting for sure
A lot
will
of
come
rewriting.
your way. Yes, sir?
In the Sigma series,
Yes. Thank you.
the number of books you refer back to the Vatican, especially when you had Monsignor Bigler and Monsignor Rowe,
Yep.
and especially the Apostle Thomas. And you talk about your historic accuracy, and John is the only one that talked about doubting Thomas.
Right.
But I wondered why Thomas, he wasn't he's the only one that wrote, there's only 4 mentions of Thomas in the entire 4 books.
I like the fact that, of course, to Gnostic gospel, Thomas was never really considered doubting Thomas. I think that was a disparaging that John took towards Thomas. Thomas was one that believed that you didn't need organized religion to find God, that God was in yourself, and everybody was special because the spirit of Christ and God was in them, was in everybody itself. And his adage was, seek and you shall find. So I like that questing. I grew up Roman Catholic. Probably not a big surprise there from the topics you just raised, and you'll see in the course of my novel. And I like the Jesuits in particular. They're sort of the religious scholars, the scientists of the religious community. I like that dichotomy between religion and science, and the way that the Jesuits seem to accept that dichotomy and trying to find that pull and pull between spirituality and scientific reasoning and the scientific method. So that's why Thomas is the figurehead that represents that to me.
There was one more hand, and then we're going to have to stop and move to our signing line. Yes, ma'am.
I was on your fan page the other day. I'm gonna watch it. There's a video of this, it's like a video preview. That's why I was surprised when you said there's no movie or anything coming out, because that video is super cool.
It's a great video. I mean, I've worked with that with Book Candy is the company that made the trailer, and they've done a lot of my trailers for the Sigma Force novels too. And so I approached him and said, I don't know if he would want to do it for a fantasy novel. So they were actually challenged to do a trailer for a fantasy novel, and I thought they did. The end result, I think, maybe that the uniqueness of it inspired them enough to produce a beautiful book trailer.
Yeah, Jim's very fortunate in his support team. We should give a shout out to David Sylvian, who does your newsletter and website and all kinds of things. He's wonderful.
Keeps on track.
He is, and I really appreciate all the support they give us, which is wonderful. So let's thank Jim for coming to see us tonight. Yay! Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.